Hello, greetings. This is going to be a relatively fast video, but I want to talk to you about some of the books that I read in September. I realize we are on like the 6th of October, so I'm a little behind, but this is literally my first time doing this, so bear with me as I put together this little September wrap up. So the first book that I read this month being September, was 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami. This is a book that I have had on my shelf for a very long time, which is actually the case with the other two as well. And this one was a lot. I actually have a whole blog post that I wrote about it, and what I'm looking at is literally the notes outlining that blog post. So I'm gonna just go through that because honestly, it's way too much for me to just like organize my thoughts. So for a quick synopsis, the novel focuses on our two protagonists, Tango and Aomame. They're both young adults, they're like late 20s, early 30s, and they went to grade school together, and they were like intensely attracted to each other in grade school. And so this romantic attraction has continued for both of them into adulthood, but they've since gone their separate ways, as most people do from grade school. But basically the whole novel focuses on / implies that they're going to come together again. So Aomame works as a fitness instructor, and then she's also a hired assassin, as one is. And Tango works as both a math teacher and an editor, which I thought was very interesting. And then he's also an aspiring author. So basically, the way that these two are brought together is by this 17-year-old girl named Eriko Fukada. And she basically enters a short story contest for like a new young writers prize thing, and then she gets published because she wins it. But Tango sort of secretly ghostwrites part of it because they get the manuscript and they're like, really solid story, but her writing is terrible, so we're gonna fix it. And then a lot of magic ensues after that. So yes, that's our synopsis. Now I'm just going to kind of really briefly go over the things that I liked and the things that I disliked. The things that I liked, right? Definitely the fantastical and the magical realism element of this was very good. They had the whole situation where there were like 2 moons in the sky. There was this idea of little people. We're not really sure what they are. It's all very mysterious and weird, and I really, really liked that. That did get kind of ruined for me later on, but we'll get there when we get there. The second thing that I liked, weirdly, was actually the manipulation of time. And what I mean by that is there wasn't exactly time travel, but there was a lot of just confusion in terms of like where we were in time. That doesn't really make any sense, but if you've read it, you know what I mean. And normally that would strike me as like a sci-fi element, and I'm really not a sci-fi person, so that would have been kind of a turnoff, honestly. But then it turned out that that really wasn't what that was, and it just worked really well for me. And I liked how confusing and mysterious that was. Lastly, the character Eriko Fukada, the little like 17-year-old author, I really, really liked the way Murakami created her as a character, because she's ethereal and not quite like normal people, and it's never explicitly stated, but you can tell that there is something kind of supernatural about her. She's just painted as very other, and I just thought that that was done really, really well, and I thought it was really cool. So those are the things that I liked pretty strongly. The things that I disliked, let's get into that. So this is a common complaint that Murakami gets, and that's the way that he writes the women in his stories and how blatantly sexualized they are. Now this is not my first Murakami book. I've read others by him, and so I was expecting that to an extent. Like, it's gross, but I'm like, it's Murakami, it's gonna happen. And it did, but it felt so much worse this time. I don't know if I've just gotten more sensitive to it or what, but like, it was just so crazy. The way that he would just describe Aomame and Eriko Fukada's breasts all the time. I don't mean that like he initially introduced them and described them there. He did that. But every time throughout the book that they come on the scene, he mentions that. He's like, oh, Aomame wished her breasts were bigger. Or Eriko Fukada had surprisingly large breasts for a 17-year-old. Like, what? Let that sink in for a second. I was not about that. That was just really gross. And it was also just like really repetitive. Like it wasn't even good writing. And it was just very upsetting. So did not like that. And that is also a complaint that I saw all over Goodreads. So I'm very glad I'm not alone in that opinion. The second thing that I didn't like, Tango and Almame at one point in the story are basically both in hiding, and not together, but like separately. They're in hiding for different reasons. And throughout those chapters, nothing really happens. Like, there's just this repeated description of how dull their lives are while they're in hiding. And I get that and I respect that, but like, it was just very, very boring to read for a long time. So I didn't like that. And then the last thing, and the most frustrating thing to me, is how incomplete this book felt, which is crazy because it is this long. The magical realism and the mystery that he built was so good, and then in the end, it didn't feel like it amounted to anything. Like, it was a relatively happy ending, but it was just really, really simple. And I was under the impression, like, I got the impression that he genuinely just got tired of writing after like 1,000 or so pages and just kind of was like, all right, we're gonna wrap it up here with like the simplest ending you could possibly find. And I was just like, that seems slightly lazy. So that was upsetting. Still really not happy with the ending. There were definitely parts of this book that were good and clever, but overall, I will never read this book again, and I really don't know if I would recommend it. I'm still very conflicted about that. I would have to give it probably like a 2.5 stars, maybe 3 stars, but it was more frustrating than I thought it needed to be. All right, let me go over the other 2 books that I read. The first one was My Antonia by Willa Cather. And this, if you don't know, is a story that takes place in the American Midwest, like on the prairie of Nebraska. So basically, this is a story about a young boy growing up into adulthood, and it just kind of traces his life from birth, literally, up until his current age, which is like his 30s or 40s. And it's nice. It's very much just a story that traces a person's life, and I can get behind that sometimes, but sometimes I do find it a little bit boring. However, the biggest thing that I didn't love about this book is that it reminded me a whole lot of Little House on the Prairie, and my childhood was saturated with Little House on the Prairie, and I like can't stand that show or those books now because of how much of them I had as a child, and so I didn't like that it reminded me of that. So that part I didn't love. However, it was much darker than Little House on the Prairie, and it was much more not for kids. So that side of it I did like. I liked that I was reading adult fiction instead of Little House on the Prairie. That was good. But yeah, overall, it's just a very basic story of a dude's life growing up on the prairie. The focus of the book is going to be him, but it's also going to be Antonia from the title. Antonia is this girl that this man grew up with. She is an immigrant from Bohemia, and she kind of just works on like a neighboring farm. Like, her family lives basically in the same vicinity as him, and they get to know each other, they grow up together, and it just kind of traces their lives. And I did think it did a good job portraying like the immigrant experience, and it's crazy to read how much has not changed since then. It's pretty crazy. I liked that part of it, and then I also liked the darker sides of it and how it was kind of raw in portraying like how actually gritty and gross American life could be back then. So I did like that aspect of it. I would recommend it for certain people. I would recommend it if you like American literature, if you like any kind of like prairie related literature, anything like that. Not a whole lot happens. It's kind of just a chill read with rattlesnakes. So yeah. And the last thing that I read was Emily Dickinson and the Art of Belief by Roger London. I picked this up thinking it was a theology book telling me why I should believe in Christianity because of how Emily Dickinson believed in Christianity, because it was recommended by one of the professors at my very Christian university, and so that's what I was assuming. It's actually a pretty legitimate biography of Emily Dickinson, and it definitely talks about Christianity in here, But Emily Dickinson was not a Christian. She outright said she couldn't quite bring herself to believe it. So that is something I did not know about her, and that was really cool to learn. I really loved this. I think that this is probably my favorite, honestly, out of the 3 that I read this month. I've been sort of obsessed with Emily Dickinson since I was like 16, so that's probably part of why I might be a little bit biased. But I've never read such a nice, comprehensive study of her life before, because it not only goes over who she was, it goes over the world that she lived in and what Christianity looked like in that world. Darwinism was becoming a thing, the Civil War was a thing, and just how all of this like messed with people's belief systems and how Emily Dickinson herself dealt with that world. And I think that that's just a really interesting angle to look at her from that I've never really encountered before. The best thing about this, to me, is that it didn't obsess over her whole being a recluse thing. It didn't try to exploit that and make it this big, entertaining mystery thing like so many things about her do. It actually just cast her as like a normal human being and was like, yes, this is why she decided to do this. This is what she believed, and this is what she decided to be, and it just is what it is. And I was just like, oh, wild. Now listen, I do not doubt that Emily Dickinson probably had some mental health problems, but this was very non-judgmental of her, and I just really liked that it read that way. So yes, honestly would recommend, especially if you are interested in Emily Dickinson, or if you are especially interested in the beliefs and Christianity and how that evolved between like the 1830s when she was born through like the 1880s when she died. So yeah, honestly, if you're into like more nonfiction scholarly stuff, I'd recommend it. That is all that I read in September. The only other thing that I could talk about is the book I'm currently reading. I started it a couple days into October, I think, and it was Insomnia by Stephen King. I am like just under halfway through it, and I am loving it. It is seriously so good so far. I've read like 4 or 5 other Stephen King books, I think. The last one I read was Misery, and I didn't really like that. I really didn't like it much. So I was a little bit put off, even though I literally like loved all of the other ones I've ever read. I read that one and I was like, eh. And so it kind of put me off of his other books for a long while. And then I found Insomnia in the bookstore and I was like, we should give him another try. So Insomnia is basically about this man who's like in his late 60s, and his wife dies of brain cancer, and then he immediately stops being able to sleep through the night. He keeps waking up earlier and earlier every night, and he doesn't know why or what's going on. Meanwhile, in his town, people are going crazy over this pro-choice movement, basically, that's happening. And they have a speaker coming to town and everything to talk about pro-choice and everything like that. And a lot of this man's friends are just losing their minds over it. And they're hurting people, they're like committing crimes, and they're just saying really crazy like conspiracy theory type things. And he's just like, what is happening to my friends? Like several months ago, these people were perfectly sane. And so we're kind of unraveling where all of the madness is coming from. At this point, he's kind of starting to hallucinate from not sleeping enough, and a lot of just really weird and creepy things are happening. So I am really enjoying that. I like it a lot, and that is where we are now. I'm gonna try to make a point to read more books in October. I will maybe do another video, kind of a TBR video. I need to go through my shelf and see which books I actually want to read and which ones I'm like ready to give away, because I know there's a good chunk on there that I'm just like, I'm never gonna read that. So I will kind of maybe film a video about that, and I think we should be good to go. And then I'll also go ahead and do the booktube newbie tag at some point. I just got to dig that up and see if people are even still doing it, and we will go from there. But yeah, I mean, let me know what you think about these books. Let me know if you've read them, and if you have any recommendations for things that like currently I need to read. But yes, for now, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.